Paris, winter of the year 885. The Seine is frozen over, a lifeless ribbon of ice beneath a gray and pitiless sky. Inside the island fortress of Ile de la Cité, smoke rises from the chimneys of homes turned into shelters. Mothers clutch their children beneath the stone arches of the old cathedral, praying that the rumble from the river is thunder, not war. But it isn't. It's the sound of oars, thousands of them. From the northern fog emerge hundreds of longships, their prows carved with dragon heads that slice through the mist like phantoms of another world. On their decks, the Vikings chant in unison, the thud of shields against wood echoing across the water. They are 7,000 strong warriors of Odin, carrying torches soaked in pitch. To the people of Paris, it feels as though the gods of death themselves have come to collect a debt long unpaid. The city's defenses are meager, wooden barricades, a handful of towers, and 2 gates guarding the only bridge that links the island to the mainland. At their head stands a man barely 30, his armor scratched, his eyes unflinching, Count Odo of Paris. He's no king, no emperor, but tonight he commands a city abandoned by both. When the Vikings demand passage and tribute, Odo answers not with gold but with arrows. The first attack begins before dawn. Arrows blot out the sky, the air smells of blood and smoke. The Vikings ram the bridge with floating towers, hurling flaming tar over the walls. For 13 hours the defenders fight hand to hand, their cries mixing with the hiss of fire on the river. By nightfall, the Seine glows red. The dead drift past the island like offerings to the underworld. When the final horn sounds, the Vikings retreat but only to wait. Outside the walls, they build camps and raise siege engines, promising to return at dawn. Inside, Odo walks through the ruins of his city. The church bells toll, not in victory, but in warning. He knows that Paris is surrounded, that no help will come from the emperor in the east. And he knows that if the city falls, so will the heart of France itself. Yet history will soon forget what truly happened here. The chronicles will praise kings who never fought and saints who never bled. The heroes who stood that winter would vanish beneath centuries of silence. Why? What truth did the scribes bury under the ashes of Paris? Because this was not merely a siege, it was the night faith itself was tested by fire, when an empire's pride began to rot from within. Before the siege, the Frankish Empire still clung to the shadow of its former greatness. The world remembered Charlemagne, the mighty ruler whose banners had once stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. He had forged Christendom's sword against the pagan north, and his descendants inherited both his throne and his illusion of unity. But by 885, that illusion was cracking. The Carolingian court had become a theater of weakness. Emperor Charles the Fat, heir to the empire's glory, was no Charlemagne. While the Viking fleets descended upon France, he sat hundreds of miles away, feasting in palaces and negotiating with ghosts. His decrees were ink on paper, powerless against the roar of oars that carried the Northmen to Paris. The once mighty empire had splintered into jealous fiefdoms, each lord guarding his borders as if they were kingdoms. The promise of Christian order had rotted into fear and betrayal, and yet, to the outside world, the Franks still wore the mask of grandeur. Chroniclers spoke of divine authority and eternal peace, of a civilization shielded by God. Churches rose high above the rivers, their bells ringing, as if heaven itself still smiled upon the Carolingian name. The court poets praised kings who never held a sword, and priests who confused surrender with salvation. History, as written by the victors, shone with gold, but the gold was peeling. It was in this world of fading triumph that the Vikings appeared like a mirror held to decay. They were not merely raiders or pagans, they were a force of nature, drawn to the scent of weakness. For decades, they had plundered the coasts of France, burning monasteries and ransoming cities. But Paris was different. It was the crown of the realm, the very heart of the empire's faith. To strike there was to challenge the divine order itself. Count Odo stood at the center of this contradiction. Born into a noble house, son of Robert the Strong, who had fallen in battle against the same northern raiders, Odo carried both his father's blood and his unfinished war. He had no illusions of imperial aid. He knew that the banners of Charlemagne were now just relics. What remained was the courage of those who refused to kneel. As the first months of the siege began, Paris still believed in its sanctity. Priests marched along the walls, chanting psalms to drive away the demons from the north. The citizens whispered that God would not allow his chosen city to fall. But Odo, looking out over the scene, saw a different truth. Faith without action is merely hope dressed in fear. Behind the mask of piety, the empire was rotting. Every letter Odo sent for help vanished into silence. The emperor's envoys spoke of patience, of divine timing, of negotiations with the invaders. But no soldiers came. The Carolingians hid behind their crosses, while the young count prepared to fight with whatever men Paris could muster. History would later call it the defense of the faithful. But in truth, it was the betrayal of an empire by its own crown. And as the torches of the Vikings burned along the riverbanks, the last illusion of Carolingian glory began to crumble into ash. But behind every illusion of glory lies a machine built on fear. The Carolingian Empire, for all its hymns and sanctified decrees, was never united by faith. It was held together by tribute. The same gold that once funded churches now bought peace from invaders. Year after year, the emperors paid the Vikings to leave, only to watch them return in greater numbers. It was a cycle of cowardice disguised as diplomacy, and Paris was about to pay the price. When the Viking fleet reached the Seine, their demand was simple: safe passage through to Burgundy in exchange for silver. But Emperor Charles refused to fight and refused to pay. He sent word to Odo, hold the city, delay them, and God will provide deliverance. What he meant was, asterisk, you are on your own. Asterisk, so Odo turned his city into a fortress. He reinforced the gates at the bridges with iron and oak. He flooded the riverbanks to slow the Viking advance. From the towers, archers lined the parapets, their bows drawn not only against the enemy, but against despair. And then, in the gray light of dawn, the machine of death began to move. The Vikings unleashed their siege engines, massive towers rolling on wheels, battering rams tipped with iron, catapults hurling barrels of pitch and oil. Their drums thundered in rhythm, a war hymn to Odin that shook the walls themselves. The citizens of Paris watched in terror as the horizon burned. Yet within the chaos, a strange order emerged. The Vikings were not madmen. They were engineers of fear. Their attacks followed a brutal logic. They built floating platforms across the Seine to cut the city off. They dammed tributaries to flood the fields, starving the defenders of food. They catapulted the bodies of the dead back into the city to spread disease. Every movement was calculated, every act of terror designed to grind Paris into submission. Inside the walls, Odo's own machine responded. The bell of Saint-Germain tolled at every attack. The young count moved from tower to tower, directing defense with a precision that stunned even his enemies. He ordered boiling oil poured over ladders, collapsing bridges at the last second, trapping entire war bands beneath the river. And for every Viking arrow that struck the stones, the defenders sent 10 back. But what the chroniclers rarely wrote was the price of that resistance. The city became a tomb. Corpses piled in the streets, rats fed on the fallen. The air stank of rot and smoke, and the Seine, once the lifeline of Paris, became a grave, and through it all, the emperor remained silent. Abbo, the monk who chronicled the siege, called it the War of the City of God. But his verses hid the darker truth. The empire had abandoned its own creation. The so-called defenders of Christendom had become merchants of peace, trading prayers for silver. The machine of destruction was not just the Viking army, it was the system that allowed them to come again and again, unchecked, feeding on the weakness of kings who mistook fear for faith. And while Europe prayed, the flames rose higher. The siege was no longer just a battle for land, it was the unmasking of a civilization that had forgotten how to fight for its soul. By the spring of 886, Paris had ceased to be a city. It was a wound that refused to close. The once bustling marketplaces had turned into cemeteries, the bells of the cathedral into alarms of survival. Every dawn brought the same sound. The groaning of wood as another Viking tower inched closer to the wall, the whistling of arrows slicing through the fog, and the muffled prayers of those who no longer believed God was listening. 13 months. That was how long the siege endured, an eternity in the language of hunger. More than 2,000 Parisians perished within the walls. Some starved, some burned, others drowned beneath the river when bridges collapsed under fire. Disease ran like wildfire, spread by the corpses hurled over the ramparts. And yet, the defenders fought on, driven by something deeper than loyalty, the refusal to vanish. Outside the city, the Viking camp had become an empire of its own. Over 7,000 warriors lived by the river, their tents stretching for miles, lit by the constant glow of burning tar. Rollo's banner, a blood-red wolf, hung above the encampment. He had turned the siege into ritual. Each morning, his men sharpened their blades before statues of Odin carved from fallen trees. Each night, they feasted on the spoils taken from surrounding villages. The chronicles describe the Vikings as beasts, but the truth is more unsettling. They were methodical. They built siege ramps that bridged the river, constructed catapults that could launch entire barrels of fire, and used mirrors of polished bronze to signal across the fog primitive communication at a scale Paris had never seen. Their genius was their cruelty. They knew that starvation could conquer what swords could not. Inside the walls, Count Odo refused surrender. He sent messengers boys barely 16 through enemy lines to plead for aid. Most were captured and mutilated. Still, one reached the emperor's court. Charles the Fat, true to his name, delayed. He called for councils, offered prayers, and waited for omens. By the time he finally marched toward Paris, half the city was already ash and bone. When the imperial banners appeared on the horizon, hope flickered once more. The citizens lit fires on the towers, believing deliverance had come. But Charles brought not vengeance, he brought negotiation. Instead of breaking the siege, he offered Rollo gold and permission to raid Burgundy if he left Paris alone. It was betrayal masquerading as mercy. The Vikings took the deal, collected their silver, and sailed away, leaving behind only corpses and silence. The empire called it peace. History would later call it policy. But for the people of Paris, it was nothing less than treason. They had endured famine, disease, and fire, only to be sold for coin. Centuries later, archaeologists would find remnants of that inferno. Arrowheads fused to charred stone, spear tips warped by heat, and fragments of human bone buried in the silt of the Seine. The soil still carries traces of oil and ash, proof of the nights when the river burned. And in the heart of Ile de la Cité, beneath the modern streets, lie layers of scorched timber, the bones of the ancient walls that once defied the north. These remains tell the story no chronicler dared to write, that the siege was not just a military assault, but a reckoning. The empire that claimed to defend faith had bartered it away, and in doing so, created a new order born from ruin. Because from the ashes of that betrayal would rise two powers, the defiant Count Odo and the pagan warlord Rollo, each destined to reshape France in blood and in legacy. When the siege finally broke, Paris did not celebrate. The streets were silent except for the sound of crows. The survivors crawled from the ruins with hollow eyes, their faith torn between gratitude and rage. For 13 months, they had prayed for deliverance, only to be saved by gold instead of God. The city was free, but not redeemed. Among those who lived was Abbo, a monk from Saint-Germain-des-Prés. He had watched everything: the flames devouring the bridges, the sky blackened with arrows, the young count riding through walls of fire to rally his men. Years later, he would write times Bella Parisiacae Urbis, times The Wars of the City of Paris, a poem that reads like scripture and confession in equal measure. His verses are the closest thing we have to the voice of Paris itself. He wrote of Odo's courage, a man who, when the gates burned, rode out alone through the Viking lines to find food for his starving people. He wrote of Goslin, the bishop who turned his cathedral into a fortress and died with a sword in hand. And he wrote of the nameless women who carried stones to the walls, children who fetched water from the river, soldiers who stood on corpses just to keep fighting. But what Abbo did not write, perhaps what he could not, was the price they paid after the war. The empire that had abandoned Paris did not reward its defenders. Emperor Charles the Fat, consumed by paranoia and guilt, was deposed within 2 years. He died alone, without allies or heirs, remembered as the last Carolingian to wear the imperial crown. Odo, the young count who saved Paris, was proclaimed king by the people in 888. Yet even as he wore the crown, he remained an outsider in his own realm. The southern nobles refused to recognize him. The clergy whispered that he was no true heir, only a soldier made king by desperation. Betrayal followed him like a shadow. He spent his final years fighting civil wars against those he had once defended. When he died at 41, France was fractured beyond repair. And yet, in the ashes of that ruin, something new began to form. Rollo, the Viking who once sought to burn Paris to the ground, accepted baptism and allegiance to the French crown. In 911, he was granted the land that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen. There, his descendants would grow into dukes and kings, culminating in William the Conqueror, who would cross the sea and reshape England itself. The irony is haunting. The very man who failed to conquer Paris was rewarded with a kingdom. The same empire that betrayed its defenders built its future upon the invader's bloodline. Modern science has only deepened this story. Excavations along the Seine have uncovered skeletons charred by oil and flame bodies that match Abbo's descriptions of the inferno. Forensic analysis reveals signs of brutal combat, shattered ribs, arrow wounds in the spine, skulls crushed by blunt force. Carbon dating confirms what the chronicles imply: the siege lasted through every season, winter to winter. But there is more. A genetic study published by French archaeologists traced Viking DNA in modern Parisians, especially near the river's old floodplain. The conquerors did not vanish. They became part of the city they tried to destroy. The blood of Paris now carries the blood of the North. It is this paradox, the merging of victim and invader, that defines the legacy of the forgotten siege. The bones beneath the streets whisper a single truth: that survival often demands surrender, and that history's heroes rarely win without losing something sacred. Paris endured, but it was never the same, and neither was Europe. Centuries have passed since the fires of 885 lit the sky above Paris, yet their embers still glow beneath the city's stones. Walk through Ile de la Cité today and you tread upon a grave layered in centuries of silence. Beneath the Gothic arches of Notre Dame, where incense rises and choirs sing of salvation, lie the same foundations that once bled under the siege. The stones have been replaced, but the memory has not. History often remembers kings, but it forgets the nights they abandoned their people. It celebrates peace, yet rarely admits the price paid for it. The siege of Paris is one such wound stitched over by glory, reopened by truth. It was more than a battle between pagans and Christians, or between Vikings and Franks. It was a confrontation between courage and corruption, faith and fear. Odo's defiance gave birth to the spirit of a nation that refused to kneel. His story became a whisper carried through centuries of struggle, inspiring knights, rebels, and citizens who would later defend Paris against every siege that followed. But his sacrifice also revealed the poison running through empires, the cowardice of rulers who mistake compromise for wisdom. When Charles the Fat paid for peace, he sold not just the safety of a city, but the soul of a civilization. Rollo's victory, though measured in silver, would shape Europe in ways no one foresaw. His bloodline would conquer kingdoms. His descendants would carry the Norman banner across seas and centuries. Out of the ashes of one siege rose the dynasties that would rule both France and England. The empire that abandoned Paris birthed a lineage that changed the Western world. And what of the people, the forgotten thousands who starved, burned, and fought beneath those walls? Their names are lost, but their courage endures in every stone rebuilt, every cathedral bell that still rings. They were not heroes in legend, only humans in agony, and that makes their story all the more sacred. The archaeologists who unearthed the charred remains by the Seine did not find relics of conquest, they found proof of endurance. Every arrowhead, every blackened fragment of wall is a reminder that civilization survives not through kings, but through those who refuse to yield when kings abandon them. The siege of 885-886 was not the end of Paris, it was its baptism. From those flames emerged the first heartbeat of a new France, born not from empire, but from resistance. And perhaps that is the greatest truth buried beneath the centuries, that history's darkest nights often forge its brightest dawns. As the bells of Notre Dame toll today over the same river where Viking ships once burned, their sound carries the weight of 1,000 voices: the soldiers, the monks, the mothers who prayed beneath a collapsing sky. Their echoes rise with every note, whispering across the ages. Asterisk. Never trust the silence of peace built on cowardice. Never forget the courage of those who stood when faith faltered. Asterisk. Because the Vikings may have vanished from Paris, but their shadow and the lessons they left behind never did.